How is Russia's economy doing? Slower economic growth. After strong momentum in 2023-2024, driven by military and war spending, Russia's GDP growth is decelerating. Forecasts from institutions such as the IMF and the EBRD point to modest growth between 1% and 1.5% to 2.5% in 2025, well below the levels of previous years. High inflation and interest rates. Inflation has remained persistent, reaching around 9 to 10% in 2024, with basic food prices rising sharply. To combat this, the central bank raised its key interest rate to very high levels. This makes credit more expensive, hurts private investment, and strains more vulnerable businesses. Budget challenges and deficit. The 2024 budget deficit was estimated at around 1.7% of GDP. The National Wealth Fund, an important source to cover some government costs, was heavily used, significantly reducing its liquid reserves. A large share of public spending continues to go to defense, national security, and the costs of the war in Ukraine. This puts pressure on other areas of the budget. Structural challenges. Labor shortages, military mobilization, war deaths, and emigration have reduced the available workforce. Dependence on energy exports. Oil and gas remain critical revenue sources, and there are efforts to redirect exports to Asia as Western markets become more restricted by sanctions. Future risks. There is a risk of entering stagflation, weak growth combined with high inflation. Companies outside the defense and state-linked sectors face growing pressure, high credit costs, reduced investment, and rising debt. Political and social. Government, elections, and power control. Vladimir Putin remains in power. The 2024 presidential elections were marked by international criticism regarding their transparency and fairness. The state apparatus maintains tight control over society, including repression of dissenting voices, censorship or restricted internet access, and laws limiting freedom of expression. Censorship and internet restrictions. There have been recent records of internet shutdowns, access cuts, or interference in certain regions. The government justifies some measures as necessary for security, for example against drones or external threats. Diplomatic and external tensions. The war with Ukraine continues to have external repercussions, sanctions, international criticism, airspace violations of neighboring countries with drones, and joint military exercises with allies such as Belarus. Strategic ties have been strengthened with non-Western countries, such as Iran, as a way to circumvent part of the sanctions' impact. Military. Russia continues mobilizing forces for the war in Ukraine, with both internal and external consequences. Externally, drone incursions, tensions with neighbors, and military drills create unease in NATO. Internally, there are reports of increased use of prison or correctional labor in remote regions, such as the Arctic, including people convicted in cases linked to war censorship. Central scenario. Baseline hypothesis. The war continues, but without major new escalations. Sanctions remain. The Russian government manages to absorb economic shocks. There is some diplomatic negotiation, but no full ceasefire or surrender. How it would unfold. Economic growth will remain modest, around 1 to 2% per year, as many forecasts already suggest. Inflation will remain a problem, though it may ease somewhat, perhaps in the 5 to 8% range or more, depending on external shocks, fuel, food. The government will keep spending heavily on defense and security, sacrificing or limiting investments in civilian sectors, infrastructure, and public services. The economic war footing will be a central element of budget policy. Energy exports, oil and gas, will remain vital. More will be redirected to Asian markets, China, India, etc., to partially offset losses in Western markets. Projects like the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline with China are part of this strategy. Sanctions will remain in place, perhaps intensifying in certain domains: technology, finance, critical raw materials. This will continue to limit industrial modernization, access to Western technology, and foreign private investment capacity. Domestic politics will remain more authoritarian, with reinforced control over the media, civil society, resource mobilization for military purposes, and repression of dissent or social protests. Possible consequences: worsening living standards for many citizens, high inflation, cuts or stagnation in public services, higher state welfare costs. Social discontent may arise, especially if sacrifices are seen as too heavy without clear benefits. Smaller protests or local demonstrations are possible, though space for opposition is limited. Technological and foreign capital constraints could delay or halt several civilian industrial sectors. Risk of economic exhaustion if war costs and sanctions keep piling up. Shrinking state reserves, growing budget deficit, rising domestic debt, and labor shortages. Pessimistic scenario: harsher sanctions, falling international energy prices, rising military tensions, internal or external, accumulating institutional problems, and significant political strain. How it would unfold: economic growth close to zero or even recession in some quarters. Persistently high inflation, possibly above 10% at times, with currency depreciation, especially if external markets close further. Sharp drop in energy exports or oil on gas prices without capacity to compensate through domestic production. Rising budget deficits, state reserves, and sovereign funds drained quickly. Shortages of imported inputs for industries, especially high-tech. Deterioration of civilian infrastructure, energy supply issues in some regions, refinery attacks, logistical failures. Greater public dissatisfaction, protests, local conflicts, more serious social tensions, especially if benefits, jobs, or purchasing power are cut. Possible political or military outcomes: the regime may face a legitimacy crisis or internal dissent, especially from groups bearing the brunt of economic or social costs: urban population, disadvantaged regions. Possible leadership change, partial or total, if political costs become too high for current rulers, or an even more centralized government responding with exceptional measures. Military difficulties: inability to replace lost equipment or personnel, territorial losses, or inability to sustain offensives. Reinforcement of internal security operations to suppress criticism or dissent. More active diplomacy or international pressure may force concessions, perhaps forced negotiations or partial armistices. Critical factors determining which scenario prevails. 1. International oil and gas prices. If high, Russia can partially offset sanctions. If low, the pessimistic scenario becomes much more likely. 2. Sanctions and access to technology and capital. If strengthened, especially in key areas like military or civilian technology, or prolonged, they will erode industrial capacity, innovation, and investment. 3. States' resource mobilization capacity, both human, labor, military, company operations, and financial, reserves, debt, tax revenues. Exhaustion of these resources would bring rising costs and instability. 4. Internal population resilience. The social costs of war, inflation, unemployment, and living standards. If these translate into protests or political instability, they may force changes or adjustments.